the last couple of weeks, we were, as we moved from Palm Sunday then into Easter, we were looking at the journey to the cross and then from the cross. And previous to those 2 weeks, we had been on a journey of about 8 weeks. And the idea was that we were going to be walking with Moses and the children of Israel as they went from a place of bondage to a place of freedom. And the series was supposed to take 8 weeks. It was supposed to take 8 weeks. But along the way, I found myself intrigued in certain spots that I wasn't really thinking about when I put the series together. And so we hit this spot just before Palm Sunday, and I thought to myself, I'm not yet quite finished with this series. So we have 3 more weeks left, I think. I think 8 will be 11, and that will be that. But I want us to go back to where we were before we hit Palm Sunday in this series with Exodus. Now, the series is called Exodus, From Bondage to Freedom. And the whole idea is that we would begin to look at our lives and listen to them as we walk with Moses and the children of Israel and learn some things about ourselves, asking ourselves on the front end and at every step along the way, what would it be like for me to be free? And I had wanted that question to be kind of reverberating inside of me because really that is the journey with Christ. It is a journey of freedom. But oftentimes, though we are free, we don't live like that. And many of us who would call ourselves by the name of Christ, call ourselves a Christ follower, spend so much of our day and weeks and lives just hampered by the spirits of fear. I mean, we're so afraid to take risks and to try new things that we're almost paralyzed by fear sometimes. We're free, but we're not. And some of us who have had difficult experiences in our lives and as a result of those experiences have grown to be angry and to hold on to that anger, have become bitter over time. We're not free. That bitterness sort of guards our heart and it controls our mind and it guides our thoughts. There are a lot of things that keeps you and I from being free. The need to please people. Sometimes people who are no longer even with us. We're trying to please parents who are no longer alive. Mates that we're no longer with. Children that have long since gone. Oftentimes in our lives there are these things that keep us from being free. And so what I wanted you to do over the period of those first 8 weeks is just to think about what is it that's in me that is keeping me from being everything that God wants me to be. Free to be the best and worst of myself and to grow and to become God's best. And so we're going to pick that thought back up as we move into this week and the next couple of weeks and finish out this journey with Moses and the children of Israel. Now, I titled the series Exodus, but for these last 3 weeks, we're actually going to leave that book because we've squeezed as much out of Exodus as we can. But the journey continues. It's covered in 2 other books. The book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy. And so this morning we're going to look actually at a portion of Numbers and Deuteronomy. Now, if you were not with us, and even if you were, I would imagine that maybe there have been a lot of things that have been going on in your life that you might have forgotten where we stopped. Hard to imagine that a few weeks ago you could forget all of the scintillating information that's coming from this place. But when we last left the children of Israel, they were right in a place called Kadesh Barnea. They were on the southern border of Canaan, the promised land. This was a place that God had given to them, promised to them, and they were right on the verge. Moses sent 10 spies into the land to check it out. 2 came back with a positive report, 8 came back with a negative report, and the majority won, and they decided not to go forward. Why? Because they were totally afraid. They said the land is everything you told us it would be. It is metaphorically, physically, it is a place that is flowing with milk and honey. Clusters of grapes and figs and all sorts of produce. It was the best that they had ever seen. But at the same time, they saw giants in the land. They saw the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they were afraid. And their fear drove them to turn, to revolt. They actually wanted to kill Moses. They wanted to find a new leader, and they wanted to go back. They were on the verge, right, of this great promise that God had given to them. Caleb and Joshua said, let's do it. God's been with us the whole way. These last 2 years, our wanderings, He's led us during the day by a pillar of cloud and at night by fire. He's provided food for us every step along the way. We've had our same clothes. They haven't worn out, kind of like Gilligan's Island episode. You know, same clothes. They've lasted years. And here we are. God at every place along the way has been with us. Let's go. This is His promise to us. Why not? But they were afraid and they went back. And what happened during those next 38 years was that the people who were leading, not Moses, not Joshua, not Caleb, but basically the people who had decided that this was too much for them, they basically died out. An entire generation of people who had no faith had to die before a group of people with faith would go back to where they started and take the place of promise that God had offered to them. So, that's where we left them. They were in a place of promise, right on the verge of it. Because of fear, they moved backwards and they died out in the wilderness. Okay? So for the next 38 years, they're wandering around. They're overcoming enemies. God's providing for them in a variety of ways. He's building their faith. Okay? And now they come back today to Kadesh Barnea. They're right in the same spot again. And now it's their children who are on the verge of promise. And that's where I want us to pick up the story this morning. Where you would find this is in Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20. Now you may or may not know this story, and if you don't, after all of this wandering, would you think they're ready? It's time, they're ready to go and move forward? Would you be ready after wandering for about 40 years to finally move into God's promises? It's a good question for you to consider, because some of you have been wandering, maybe not for 40 years, but 5 or 10 or 15 or 20, maybe longer. And the question to you is it time to move forward and not backward? Is it time to stop letting your fear dictate and control your life? Is it time to believe what God has promised you and to walk into it? That's the question. Here's the answer for them. Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. In the first month of the year, the whole community of Israel arrived in the wilderness of Zin and camped at Kadesh. While they were there, Miriam, Moses' sister, died and was buried. Now there was no water for the people to drink at that place. So they rebelled against Moses and Aaron. The people blamed Moses and said, if only we had died in the Lord's presence with our brothers. Why have you brought the congregation of the Lord's people into this wilderness to die, along with all our livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here to this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, and no water to drink. If you didn't know any better, you would think this was Exodus chapter 17 in their wilderness. It's an entirely different group of people. It's the kids now who have grown up or not. It's the same thing. They are parroting the exact same words. In all of this time of wandering, in all of this hardship, in all of this suffering, and all of the ways that God has provided for them along the way, they find themselves right back on the edge of the promise of God, and they respond exactly the same way. What is up with this? I mean, when you look at this, is it hard to believe that somebody could do this? For me, when I read it, it's just like, really? Like, after all this time, still the same response? Let's follow the story and see what Moses and Aaron do. So Moses and Aaron, Moses has had to be sick. Moses and Aaron turned away from the people and they went to the entrance of the tabernacle, which represents what? The presence of God. The people are about to revolt again. There's no water. They're thirsty. Why wasn't their response, Lord, you provided water from any number of different sources? Why wasn't their response to go to the tabernacle? Why wasn't their response to fall on their face? Why wasn't their response to seek God, to turn to rather than away from God? It wasn't. But it was for Moses and Aaron. So they go to the tabernacle. And when they went to the entrance, they fell face down on the ground. Then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, "You and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community. As the people watch, speak to the rock over there, and it will pour out its water. You will provide enough water from the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock." So just speak to the rock. Isn't this silly? It's crazy. I can think of any number of different ways that God might provide water. Speaking to a rock would not necessarily be in the top 10, right? But we've gone through this before. God uses the most unlikely places and means to provide for us. If we open our eyes and see, those rocks, they're all around us. And He wants to provide for us as we turn to Him and seek Him. So Moses goes. Moses did as he was told. He took the staff from the place where it was kept before the Lord. Then he and Aaron summoned the people to come and gather at the rock. "Listen, you rebels," he shouted. Probably a few other things. "Must we bring you water from this rock?" Then Moses raised his hand and he struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out. So the entire community and their livestock drank it. There's a problem here. Now, those of you who've read this story before, you will know what the problem is. Those of you who have not heard it before, you might not see the big deal. But God didn't tell Moses to strike the rock, did He?
No.
He told Moses to speak to the rock. But Moses was what? He was angry. And so would you be. I mean, you're right back in the same place. You've wandered around when we told you we could go in and take the thing. We're finally back, and you're doing the same old thing. Who wouldn't be angry at this point? And remember, Moses had an anger problem. Right? He's being rehabilitated, but I think the thing would go with him his entire life. And there he is. He's just taking this rod, this staff, perhaps the same one that he lifted when he parted the waters of the Red Sea. And he just beats the rock. He's angry. Now, God doesn't prevent, because he's disobedient, he doesn't prevent the water from coming out. He still provides for his people, but there is going to be some discipline for Moses. Let's read what that is. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I am giving them." This place was known as the waters of Meribah, which means arguing, because there the people of Israel argued with the Lord, and there he demonstrated his holiness among them. So what's the big deal? I mean, he just hit a rock after all he had done. I mean, Moses had been through it. Moses is now 120 years old. He had poured out his entire life on behalf of his people. He had been deeply disappointed by their responses, and he had been dragged by their disobedience into wilderness-like places. And so he gets to a place where he's a little bit angry, and he strikes the rock. What's the big deal? Now he can't go into the land of promise just because he hit the rock? At first glance, that's what it looks like. And if you have a heart at all, this just hurts a lot. If you read this passage and you don't feel for Moses, you don't understand his story. Seemingly everything that he had been living for and working for now is gone. And I think the reason why this is so upsetting to me is because maybe if this can happen to Moses, this can happen to me too. And that's how we feel a little bit as we read the story. That you can live your life in a certain way and get to a place where the stakes are so high and you make one decision where the discipline becomes so great that you're not able to enter into the very promise that God had given you from the beginning. You read this and you say, I don't understand. But here's what God said to Moses. He said,
You did not trust me, so there's issues of trust still after all these years, to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel. It was an issue of trust, it was an issue of obedience, it was an issue of self-control, and it was an issue of holiness. Who was it that was representing God to the people? It was Moses. Now they had just spent 38 years wandering around in the wilderness. What happens if God just lets this slide? What happens if God just allows Moses a free pass on this? The people were having a hard enough time appreciating the holiness of God as it was anyway. Now if the very person who was entrusted with displaying and showing that holiness could not contain his anger long enough to do what God had asked him to do, it was only going to be worse for the people. Whether we like it or we don't like it, our actions have consequences. And these consequences are great. Now I want to continue the story, moving to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23. At that time, he says, I pleaded with the Lord, and I said, O sovereign Lord, you have only begun to show your greatness and the strength of your hand to me, your servant. Is there any God in heaven or on earth who can perform such great and mighty deeds as you? Please let me cross the Jordan to see the wonderful land on the other side, the beautiful hill country and the Lebanon mountains. But the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he would not listen to me. That's enough, he declared. Speak of this no more. But go up to Pisgah and look over the land in every direction. Take a good look, but you may not cross the Jordan River. Instead, commission Joshua, encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead the people across the Jordan. He will give them all the land you now see before you as their possession. So we stayed in the valley near Beth Peor. This seems so cool. Does it seem cool to anybody? It seems cool to me. You can't go in. You can go up to the mountain and you can look, but you can't go in. It's like rubbing his nose in it. And the longer I sat with this, the longer I realized that this probably hurt God as much as it did Moses. See, I think the deal is this. We don't see things most often as they are. We see them as we are. And so when I read this story, I project some of my stuff over onto God. And I just want you to understand that in the nature of the relationship that Moses and God had, it was as great as any who had come before and most who came after. God loved Moses. God showed great favor on him. It's just in this moment as I read this, I can't help but think about some of the feelings and some of the emotions that must be going on here. But I wonder how God felt about it. I oftentimes think for Moses, this was just such a raw deal, but I believe, if I really understand the story to be completely true, this was as hard for God as it was for Moses. But God had to do something. What else would you have him do? Send him back out for 40 more years? Good Lord, he's 120. How long do we want to keep him out there? You know? What would we like for God to do in this moment? So when you're reading the scriptures, maybe it's important for you to remember that oftentimes we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And maybe if we can step aside for long enough to understand, this isn't God being a meaning to Moses. There's a holiness issue involved here. And the stakes are very high. Because God loves these people, even though they've been rebels, even though they've been disobedient, even though they can't get it right. He loves them, and he doesn't want them to continue in this way. But if the leadership isn't guiding them in a way that would be appropriate, that would consciously show the distinction of God's holiness to them, then he has to correct it. He has to discipline it. And that's the end result. So Moses is going back and forth. I wonder if in this, remember Moses many times when he interceded on behalf of the children of Israel, he would ask God to change his mind. There were several times along the way that God was just going to do him in. And Moses got on his face and said, please don't do them in. He interceded. And God did what? He changed his mind. So I wonder if Moses in this place actually thought, maybe God will change his mind if I just pray hard enough, right? And that's what we get. Sometimes we come in this place and if we pray hard enough, maybe if we could just plead eloquently enough, maybe God will relent, maybe God will change his mind. It had happened before, there was precedent. God was not changing his mind in this case. Now you'll get something similar as you move towards the end of Deuteronomy chapter 32. The whole chapter in Deuteronomy 32 is Moses at the end of his life, and he's singing a song. He's happy. He's recounting all of the ways in which God has been at work in his life and in the life of the people. And then in verse 48 of chapter 32 it says, that same day the Lord said to Moses, go to Moab, to the mountains east of the river, and climb Mount Nebo, which is across from Jericho. Look out across the land of Canaan, the land I am giving to the people of Israel as their own special possession. Then you will die there on the mountain. You will join your ancestors just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and joined his ancestors. For both of you betrayed me with the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. You failed to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel there. So you will see the land from a distance, but you may not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. So what if in this moment, as Moses comes to this place of acceptance, what if in this moment the picture is a little bit different than God rubbing Moses' nose and seeing what he can't add? What if it's a picture of an old couple sitting on a porch in a swing, looking at what the people are about to have, communing with one another, just being content in the presence of each other? Because I think, if I go back and read the story, if you will remember, there were a couple times where Moses says, listen, if you're not going with us, I don't want to go. And the scriptures would say, and God said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And Moses would say, well then I'll go, but I'm not going without you. What if the promised land really has not so much to do with the place that we're going to as it does with being in the presence of God and love and a place of peace? I mean, I think next to everything else that Moses experienced, everything else paled in significance to him. I mean, what if in your life, as you think about that place that you're wanting to get to, that place that you're wanting to go, what if you began to understand that the promised land is less about any physical destination as it is more about a way of life? What if the promised land is more about a way of living that enables us to love and be loved by God fully, even if it's on His terms and not our own? What if we don't always get to draw up the terms? What if it isn't us that's always in control? What if it isn't us that always gets to have our own way? Could you be content in the presence of God, even if you're reflecting on what might have been, if you knew that you were fully known and fully loved by God, and that everything was okay anyway? I picture Moses and God as just an old couple who've gotten to the end of their life, Moses anyway, and they're sitting and reflecting and looking and thinking about what might have been. And as he gets to this place where he's getting ready to die, he's just at peace. Notice in this passage, he's not arguing with God anymore. He's not trying to get over or get away enjoying the fullness of the presence. And it means more to him than anything else, because his death is just one more step closer to the intimacy that he sought with God for his entire life. He's not worried anymore. He's about ready to pass to the other side. And he's just content. He's just at rest. If you think about it, like many of the others who had gone before him and who would come after, there's this passage in Hebrews chapter 11. It's the chapter of, it's kind of like a hall of fame of faith. And I want to read you a particular passage that comes from there that speaks to this issue about believing for something but never getting to see it, touch it, taste it, feel it. These are people like Abel and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Joseph it speaks of. And it said, all of these people died, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance, and they welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. These people of faith weren't looking to go back to Egypt every time things got tough. They were moving forward, not backward. And most of them didn't get to where they wanted to go. But they got something better, and that's what I'm getting at here with Moses. Let me read you one more piece. These people, they placed their hope in a better life. Verse 35. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. And I get to this place in the story, and I just think there's so much that all of us want. And we have a dream for what we want our life to be like. And we think that if we're good little boys and girls, that if we go to church and we pray hard and we do the right thing, that somehow it's incumbent upon God to give us all the desires of our heart. And it makes good sense that that's the case. But in our relationships with God, we're not the ones who are in control. We don't get to call those shots. It's very fair to have desires in our hearts. And it's very fair to ask God to meet us and to lead us and to provide for us in every place along the way. But when God doesn't give us what we want, our response to that will ultimately shape who it is that we are and who it is that we become and where it is that we go. Moses is 120 years old at this time. And if you're familiar with his story at all, the guy is very real and human. I mean, he had stuff that he was working out all until the last day of his life, but he was a great dude. I mean, he did so much on behalf of so many. But he gets to this place, and this place is so important. Let us not project onto the story our stuff. He gets to this place, and he is at such peace as he sits with God and he looks at what's going to happen for the people who are coming behind him. Nebo's about 4,000 feet high. Moses is 120 years old. He's still climbing mountains, man. I want to close by telling you this and then making one piece of practical application. This is perhaps one of the sweetest passages in all of the Scriptures. It's Deuteronomy chapter 34. It's Moses and God, and it's Moses' final time with God. 1. Then Moses went up to Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab, and he climbed Pisgah Peak, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead as far as Dan, all the land of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, extending to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the Jordan Valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. It's a beautiful place. I've actually been there. It's just a beautiful, wonderful, majestic sight. And I can envision, as God and Moses are there, it's sort of what they saw. It's wonderful. Then the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have now allowed you to see it with your own eyes, but you will not enter." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, just as the Lord had said. And the Lord buried him. How awesome is that? In the last moments of his life, there's this place of intimacy and rest and acceptance. And there's not a great crowd of people. In fact, to this day, nobody knows where Moses was buried, and I think that's intentional. God gave it his rest. People would be setting up all kinds of shops and selling souvenirs. Moses got to rest. He deserved a little bit of rest after what he had to deal with, but there God is, and God buries him. Can you just imagine God burying Moses? I think it was as hard for God not to let him to go in as it was for Moses. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyesight was clear and he was as strong as ever. So it isn't this frail old guy who's like on life support. He's climbing a 4,000-foot mountain. He probably had 40 more in him. But it was just time. His time had come. I think to myself, I want to get to a place in my life where the presence of God is enough. Where I don't have to have my own way all the time. And when I don't get it, that I throw temper tantrums. I want, when I'm faced with problems, to go to the tabernacle and fall on my face and turn in the right direction to the only one who can help me when I need it. There's so much that we can learn from Moses, from the ways in which he fell short and the ways in which he didn't. He's a very human man, but he teaches us a lot. And when I think about all of the kinds of bondages that we can fall into, all of the kind of things that would enslave us, what I notice from Moses is there is this place where he learns how to just let go and just rest in what God has for him, whether it's what he pictured for himself or not. And so sometimes those dreams that we hold on to, those plans, those hopes, sometimes we place them over and above God, and if God doesn't give that to us, then we respond in such a way that it breaks off relationships, where there's hardness of heart, where there's such disappointment and frustration that we place over and onto God feelings that aren't really, that God isn't really responsible for. When if we would, like Moses, when we get to that place, and it's very fair game to be frustrated, to be disappointed, to be angry, to be afraid, all of those emotions, they're all fair game. But at some point, Moses learned how to let go and how to rest in the presence of God. And I think people like you and me are ever going to be free, we're going to have to learn how to do the same thing. And that's your challenge today. You're on a journey and you're moving from a place of bondage to a place of freedom, but there's certain things that you're aware of that you know you're holding on to, and there are other things that you don't even know that you're dragging behind, and the weight of them are
and you're wondering why you can't make any more progress in your journey than what you have. But if I had on a 250-pound backpack, I would probably be traveling fairly slowly myself, right? We're carrying just the weight of so many things. And at some point, it's just time for us to trust, to be in a position, and even if it's on our face before God, to just trust God with what we have and what we don't. To trust God to take us to the next place. And even if we don't get to where we hope we would get, that we would trust that in the center of God's will is the greatest place for you and I. Because that's what Moses learned. The promised land didn't have anything to do with entering into Canaan for Moses. It had everything to do with sitting on the top of Nebo with God, looking at it and resting in His presence. One final thing. Matthew chapter 17, there's this story where Jesus is on top of the Mount of Transfiguration. And He brings up Peter, James, and John. They're going to have this experience, and Peter's going to want to hang out there forever. And he's not. And it reads like this, Matthew chapter 17, verse 1. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up to a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched Jesus' appearance was transformed so that His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became as white as light. And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Guess we've got to go into the land of promise. There you are, right in the heart of glory, with Jesus on a mountaintop. It's a beautiful picture. Sometimes along the way there has to be discipline, especially the more mature you get and the further you go down the road. I'm responsible for the way in which I live my life, much like you are. But the stakes are greater for me as I'm trying to shepherd you. So I would expect such. And I try to understand that every day when I wake up. Some of us have levels of responsibility, and the stakes are very high in terms of how we live our lives. If ever I would lead any of you astray by anything that I would say or do, I would expect the consequences to be great. God has entrusted to me you. You are precious in His sight. And I'm going to live rightly and feel rightly. So every day, I feel that. And it's not heavy. It's actually a gift. But every day, you too bear the same responsibility with your wife and your husband and your children, the people at work that you have charge over. God entrusts to you certain things. And there's discipline, there's correction when we move off mark. And the truth is, we need it. Finally, the last thing I would say is this. If in this week, as you're reflecting on this part of the story, you would simply ask God, what do I need to let go of in order to be free? That you would cultivate a quiet place and begin to listen. Perhaps God may show you something that you need to release. Because we're moving into a place of trust, and it's not easy. But the more things you release, the more open your hands are to receive. I cannot receive from God if they're clinging to other things. I've got to be in a place of openness. I've got to be in a place of vulnerability. I've got to be in a place of humility. I have to learn to receive. And I would say, if you can put yourself in that place, it will take you just another step down the road towards that journey from bondage to freedom. Do you want to be free? I know you do. Well, maybe there's something you just need to let go of in order to take the next step. And I don't know what that is. But I have a feeling if you sit with God quietly and talk to Him about it, He'll help you see. And then the choice is up to you as to what you're going to do with it. You might not get everything you want. In fact, the chances are good you won't. But what if the promised land really became about you and God and about enjoying His presence no matter what came your way? I think that we can learn from Moses, and if we do, it'll be a great lesson as we continue to
help me not to project onto you things that seem unfair from my own perspective. Help me to enter your story with an openness and a vulnerability and a humility that helps me to understand that these journeys with us hurt you as much as they do us. That like any good parent who disciplines, it's difficult to discipline your children. But without that discipline, we would be rogue and rebels. And we would wander around for years and years and years until we die out in futility and lack of faith. So God, I thank you for the discipline you have given to me over time. And I and we in this moment, we release the things, God, that are keeping us from your best. Would you come alongside and help us? Help us to take the next step towards freedom as we trust in you, even when we don't understand your ways. And it's in Christ's name we